We are in the 23rd chapter now of Genesis. We've had some very important chapters in terms of important things about Israel, foundations about the nation. Obviously, here's the patriarch, Abraham. And now, after all the things that we've been through in the first 22 chapters, we come to this point about the death of Sarah. So we're going to take this whole chapter tonight and see what's in it. So let me pray for us before we start. Lord, guide us in your will, in your understanding. Give us your message. Let things that are be said true and accurate. We count on you and your spirit during this time. I pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so chapter 23. Let's read the first two verses, and let me take those first. So it says, now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Okay, now, interesting, when you look at the Hebrew text, you realize that it doesn't say 127 years like it does in the English. What it says is she lived 100 years plus 20 years plus 7 years. That's what it says in Hebrew.
That's what it says in the King James.
Oh, does it? Okay, good.
Well,
That's
it says
more
7
accurate.
and 20.
Right. So the point is that, the life and especially the death and the discussion of the burial of Sarah is the only discussion in the Old Testament of a woman who died and all the events associated with it. In other words, she stands out as unique. Okay. No one else is covered in terms of her death and burial and all the elements of it like Sarah is covered in this. Of course, part of the reason why is because she was, quote, if you want to put it this way, the mother of the Jewish nation. She was, as it were, the princess of the future nation to come. Now, if you turn to Isaiah, there's an interesting passage, I think. If you turn to Isaiah 51. And I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. So he says, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from where you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who gave birth to you in pain. When he was one I called him, then I blessed him and multiplied him. And then, of course, it goes on. So, again, an image here of Sarah as being the mother of the nation. She gave birth to Israel, literally starting with Isaac, obviously, quote, in pain. Now, what we see here is that when Isaac was born, as we've read the text, she was 90 years old. Okay? We realize that, as it's stated, that is, at the age now that she dies, that Isaac therefore must be 37 years old when his mother dies. So he's not a little kid at this point. Now, 120 and 7. 100 in biblical numerology is 10 by 10, 10 being the number of what's called numerical perfection, or sometimes it's even used to describe fulfilled promise. I think it becomes more obvious why that is a description of Sarah's life. 20 is obviously 10 times 2. That is, it is the double fulfilled promise, right? 20 times 10 times 2. Does that make sense? If 10 is the fulfilled promise, then 10 times 2 is the double fulfilled promise. And I think what that alludes to in the text is, number one, that God fulfilled his first promise to her, that is, she would have a son. True? And I think then probably the second part, or the double part of it, is that I think that Isaac returned, quote, from the dead. In other words, he was returned to her after this event in chapter 22 where he was almost sacrificed. Okay? So I think that's part of what that alludes to. Now, 7, of course, we know is the number for spiritual perfection or spiritual completion. So the point is that the Lord fulfilled his intention in Sarah completely. And you see that in all these numbers and what they seem to mean. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think, the text gives us a deeper meaning here. Now it states that she died in Hebron. Hebron, the ancient name for it is Kiriath Arba. The word Kiriath means a frame or a structure, or can mean a house of Arba. Now, Arba is a name we've run into a bunch of times in the Old Testament. Certainly we will run into this, particularly in the future, and in times we've studied in Deuteronomy, etc. And that is Arba is the name of a giant. We see references to him. If you want to see them very quickly, you can turn to Joshua chapter 14 and see one of those references. Joshua 14. And we see the reference in verse 15. It's where Caleb is getting his inheritance. Remember, the land is divided. Caleb gets a special territory that he requests. And he says, therefore, Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jehuphah, the Kenizzite, until this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. Verse 15. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, for Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had peace from war. Of course, the Anakim, that is the descendants of this original giant named Anak. Okay? And the people of that family group or branch were called the Anakim. And Arba was one of those. Now, it's interesting that in Hebrew, Arba also means the fourth. You go, why the fourth? I think there's a number of reasons why. I think it alludes to, number one, that he was either the son of 4 giants and or he was the father of 4 giant sons. And of course, both could be true. And I'm not going to go into all the other discussion about Arba and Anakim. We've talked about that when we studied the giants in chapter 6, etc. Now, the point of this, above all else, is that these individuals, okay, both the giants and the sons of Heth that we're going to be talking about tonight, were placed in the land as a purposeful satanic strategy. And this strategy was meant to prevent the fulfillment of God's promise of Abraham of the land. One of the many ways Satan tried to prevent this was putting people in the land, putting these giants as well as other people, the Canaanites, so that it would be difficult, or he thought impossible, for God to fulfill his promise and that land to be taken over. Right? Okay. Now, also, we note here, I think, a contrast as we see this. We see that Isaac is given new life as he comes back from Moriah, back to the area of Hebron, right? At the same time, we see that Sarah at the same time dies. And I think this principle, it really winds through the rest of the Bible. It's a very important theme. That is, life leads to death and death leads to life. Right? What did Jesus say? If you want to seek your life, you must lose it. Okay, give it away. If you want to not fulfill the deeds and instincts of the flesh, what must you do? You must put to death the deeds of the flesh, so that you can then start to express the fruit of the Spirit, right? So the death to life principle is a constant principle in Scripture. Now, it states here that he came to where she was, okay? Actually, in the Hebrew, it means more he went in or he entered into. And it would appear that the reference is to her tent, okay? Now, remember, in ancient world, particularly in the Middle Eastern world, usually the women and the servants of the women, the wives, the concubines had their tents, and the man, son, the male servants had their own tents. Okay, so it's unlikely, based on tradition, that they were living all the time in the same tent. So he came to her tent. Now, the other interesting statement or interesting grammatical possibility or word possibility is that it can also mean to enter into one's ancestors' afterlife time, okay, to go to one's ancestors, to go to one's fathers who have passed away before. So it also may be an allusion to that. So he's coming to her, and she, in the process, is passing away on to the afterlife, of course, where in the future they will meet again. Now, we don't know how long it was between the time that Abraham came back with Isaac and the two servants and this event occurring. I think from the text and from the tone, I think it's unlikely that it was very long, but we don't know exactly. Was it a few weeks? Was it a few months? We're not certain. We're not told exactly, but I think probably the context of what occurred was probably not long after Abraham and Isaac returned. Then, of course, the event occurs where Sarah then passes away. It says then in the verse 2, that he mourns her. The word in the Hebrew is the word saphad, and it means literally to wail, to cry, to weep, to lament, and to deeply grieve. Okay, all those things. Now, why? Well, let me give you one theory about why I think this was so difficult for Abraham to lose Sarah. Okay, let me give you a genealogy. It's not exact, but I think it's relatively close. That is, I'm going to show you that they must have been married for a very long time. Okay, here's why. In Genesis 12:4, it states that Abraham was 75 and Sarah was 65 when they left Haran before entering Canaan. Okay, now we notice that the best estimate of this time, based on the age in which Terah died, which is stated as 205 years, he was that old when he died. From that, if we subtract, I think the reasonable number is that they lived 60 years approximately in Haran with Terah until he died. Okay, now if Sarah and Abraham married when, let's say, they were around 25 years of age, okay, that's an estimate, but probably not too far off, 25 or 30 years. Then by the time they left to go to Canaan, left Haran, then they'd been married 50 years already. Does that make sense? They've been married at that point 50 years. Then we notice that they then lived 25 years once they came to Canaan before Isaac was born. Right? So there's another 25 years of their marriage. And then there's 37 more years. That is when Isaac's 37, that's the time when she dies. So if you add that up, it's very possible they were married for 112 years. That's a long time to spend with someone. Okay? Think of it in today's terms. If you have people that have been married 50 or 60 years, they spent, the vast majority of their life with their spouse. These usually are the people that when one dies, okay, the other often doesn't survive well, sometimes doesn't survive long, because their whole life is wrapped up in that person, all their experiences, their family, their background, all the events of their lives, everything. And so it's a very, very difficult blow when that person passes away. Okay. In other words, it explains, I think, for them, with the possibility of 112 years marriage, why this was so hard on him to lose his wife. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Now, it's interesting. Sarah and Abraham were born in Ur, in the land of the Chaldees, near the plain of Shinar, in what is now, central to southern Iraq area. All right. They leave there. They're married, obviously, there. They leave there. And of course, they come to this foreign land. They live among foreign people in this foreign land. And interestingly enough, she is buried among these foreign people in this foreign land. In other words, she never goes back to where she was born and where she lived and grew up. She dies and is buried in this place. Okay? She is an alien. She has no legal rights to this territory of Canaan that they're sojourning in. And yet that is the place in which her body is laid finally. Now it's interesting. This is hardly the only person who has this experience. I looked at it and realized that Joseph, of course, dies where? In Egypt. And we see that, we don't have to turn here, but in Genesis 50, verses 24 and 25, he dies, and of course he asks, his family to take his embalmed body, because actually he's embalmed in Egyptian style, and to bring it back when they leave and go back into Israel. Also, we notice in the story about Moses in Deuteronomy 34:6 is actually the verse that Moses dies east of the Jordan. Okay, he doesn't die in Israel. He doesn't die in Egypt. He dies in the territory of what probably would be, I think it's Moab. Moab would be kind of a little bit south of Jordan area, in that hill, Mount Nebo, that mountain there.
In the valley.
In the valley, he's buried, it says. So he also dies and is buried, actually there across the river, not technically in Israel. Interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, of course, it brings up this truth, the spiritual truth that we read, and we've read, turned to a number of times. We find it 1 Peter 2:11, the New Testament application. And that is, what does it call us? We are aliens and strangers. Okay?
Sojourners.
Right, sojourners. That is, as much as we think that we have our feet, dug into the ground, a house, a home, a community, spiritually speaking, none of those things are a real possession.
Right.
They're extremely temporary.
Right.
Okay? And the real possession, the real goal is, of course, is the city that we will end up living in, that is the New Jerusalem. Okay? Now, so if you would turn to Hebrews 11. I want to read this passage because I think it will make it somewhat more clear, since I've given you a lot of context here, this famous chapter about faith. Go to Hebrews 11. I'm going to read a few of these verses. I'm going to start in verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, okay, obeyed by going out to a place where he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going, right? Never been there. Foreign place, Canaan. By faith, he lived as an alien, here we go, in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. Now, up until this point, one thing I want you to note, because you'll see the tie-in here in a few minutes as we go in these verses, is up until the events that we'll talk about here in the burial of Sarah, Abraham technically owned nothing land-wise. He was given rights to pasture. He had flocks. He was given permission by Abimelech originally to have his flocks. He was given permission in other places. But at this point, up until this point in time, he owned nothing land-wise. Yeah, he had possessions in terms of herds and sheep, and obviously God made him a wealthy man, but he had no possession of land per se. Why? Verse 10, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By the way, the same one we're looking to. True? Okay. By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him, that is the Lord, faithful, who had promised. Therefore, also, there was born of one man, and him as good as dead at that is the age of his body, Abraham, as many descendants as, quote, the stars of heaven in number, and as innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. That is, these are the images of the Abrahamic promise, what the nation would become numerically. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, having confessed that they were, notice again the emphasis, strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. In other words, they knew they weren't going back. It was not their future, right? Okay. And then verse 16 was that as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. True of Abraham, true of Sarah, true of us as believers in the New Testament. Okay? The theme is all there. It just winds its way in many, many, many different strings all the way to literally today. Okay, now, all that, the first two verses. So let's go back and let's read verses 3 through 9 now. So starting at 3, then Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I'm a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you, that I might bury my dead out of my sight. Verse 5, and the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead. So Abraham rose and bowed to the people of the land, that is, the sons of Heth. And he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish for me to bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and approach Ephraim, the son of Zohar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, which is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence for a burial site. Now, there's a lot of Middle Eastern custom and tradition and practice that goes on here. And unless you understand some of it, you're not going to understand exactly what's happening. So I'll try to describe it to you. Okay. First of all, he obviously wept and grieved over his wife's body. But at a point in time, whatever that was, he recognized that the decomposing or decomposition of her body was beginning. It doesn't take long after life has left the body before it starts to decompose. So he then began to realize that he needed to therefore make a plan. Okay. And he also realized that in that plan to bury her, he owned no land to bury her. So therefore it says he, quote, rose up. That is, he got up from her side where she was, where he'd been grieving and crying for her. Okay. And he went to, which is not very far, to Hebron, to the city gate to negotiate with, quote, the sons of Heth. All right. Now, the city gate is important. Remember back when we went through Genesis 19, we found that Lot was what? Sitting at the city gate. Why? What happened at the city gate? Everything. The elders or officials of the town met at the city gate. Judgments occurred, court proceedings at the city gate. Sentences occurred at the city gate. The litigation occurred and was settled at the city gate. And the buying and selling of land and other property was verified at the city gate. That's why he went there. That was the only place he could go to settle this issue. Now, the sons of Heth, we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. They are what we believe, maybe a little bit later, probably a little bit later, actually, definitely later, and a little bit more north, actually more towards the area of Haran, where originally they stayed for those years, is what would be the Hittite territory. Now, 25 or 30 years ago, even though we read about the sons of Heth and the Hittites, very little had archaeologically been discovered about them. And some people, actually many people, of more liberal persuasion, in terms of interpreting the Bible, said that they were a made-up group, there was no evidence for them, etc. But in the last years, we've discovered records, we've discovered tablets, we've discovered buildings, we've discovered all kinds of things about the Hittites. And now we have clear documentation of really who they were. So the Bible, again, is shown to be accurate. They were not friendly particularly to Abraham and Sarah. All right, how do I know that? Well, turn, if you would, over a few chapters to Genesis 27. We're now at the time of Isaac and his wife Rebekah. All right. And in chapter 27, if you go to 46, verse 46, Rebekah is speaking. Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like these, that is, they're living around, okay, like these daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? In other words, not only did she not think well of the daughters of Heth, that is the female offspring of the, quote, as we're talking about here, sons of Heth, the Hittites, but and again, I'm not going to go into all this, but there are many, many examples in which they were problematic to the patriarchs. Okay. it was never usually a very friendly thing. So, they're living among these people that are really relatively hostile to them. But at this point in time, they were the legal landowners of this territory around Hebron. So Abraham had no choice but to deal with them about his need to buy a property to bury his wife. Okay? Now, as we've said, Abraham is a resident alien. We notice this in verse 4. It's interesting that just like Abraham was a resident alien on this property in Canaan, in the same way, we see, you don't have to turn here, but in Leviticus 25, verse 23, we see that Israel later on, after they're given the land, God calls them resident aliens on his property. In other words, God says he's the title deed owner of this place called Israel, and they can just live there, right? It's also the reason behind the importance of the tribes, once they conquered the majority of the land, being given territories that they were supposed to take care of and hold on to. And within these tribes, then family groups had even more specific areas that they were given as property. So eventually, all these family groups own specific areas of property. As we've studied in the past, we noticed that if someone got in trouble, debt, for instance, that they could lose their property. That is, they would have to sell it to another person until when?
50 years.
The 50th year, the Jubilee. And at that point, God says, no matter what's happened, no matter how many owners there's been, it reverts to its original owners. It comes back. Okay? So, now it's interesting. Abraham, in terms of burial, his experience would have been mostly and predominantly of the experience he had growing up in Ur. In that area, okay, burial was made by taking hard brick, kilned clay bricks, okay, which they then stacked into this kind of coffin-like structure. They actually constructed very carefully. And the body was laid inside this brick sepulcher and sealed. And that's how he would have known burial occurred based on his background and tradition, his culture. All right? The problem is he lives around Hebron. And again, if you've been around this area,
Caves.
go ahead and say it. Sure.
Caves.
Yeah.
Caves, and because it's mostly limestone. And of course, when water trickles through limestone after long enough, it forms caves. And all around this area of Hebron, in the hillsides, are these caves. Okay? Now, so we notice in verses 5 and 6 that the leaders are at the gate, the city gate of Hebron. This is where the business was to be transacted. They recognize, notice, you see it, let me turn back to myself, chapter 23. It says that the sons of Heth answered Abraham and said to him, "Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us." That's not the best translation. Actually, what it says in the Hebrew is that you are a mighty prince of Elohim. Okay? In other words, they recognized that he was mighty. And you can go back to the 14th chapter of Genesis in the war against the kings, the 5 kings that came down from the north. Okay? Abraham has a skilled army of men who, of course, are used in this war to gain back his nephew Lot and other people that were carried away. We know he has lots of property. We know he has lots of animals. We know he's grazed in these areas for years and years and years. He must have an enormous amount of wealth agriculturally. Okay, so that they recognize this about him. But they seem to also recognize the fact that he was blessed by Elohim, that, as it's been said, he was a prophet of Elohim, he was a speaker for the Lord. So they seem to understand this too, as they address him and talk about who he is. Now, in Middle Eastern manners, okay, when one when one is going to negotiate, in this case for a burial plot, there is a very formal system that has gone through in Middle Eastern tradition, and that is that they use mediators. Okay, so in other words, he could not go directly to Ephraim, even though that's the person's land he wants to buy, and directly negotiate him to start out. Okay, he had to go to the witnesses, the officials at the city gate. He appealed to them first, which is what's happening in verses 4 and 5. Then he gets permission to speak directly to Ephraim about this proposal. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that's what he did. But
yeah.
He's just buttering up to somebody.
Well, I don't think he's buttering up so much as they're buttering him up, because what they say is, notice the last part of, well, actually it's verse 6. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead.
That's right.
It seems to imply that they're saying, take what you want, we'll give it to you. We're such charitable people. We just be glad to help you out, buddy. You've been through a hard thing. Okay. What you're going to see as we read more verses is that's not at all what's going on. They're really not at all generous. But this was typical of the beginning of the Middle Eastern negotiation. Okay. I remember, and I don't know if you guys did it when you were in Israel, but I remember being in the old city, and I was going through one of the shops, and I saw this shirt that I wanted to buy.
Did you negotiate?
Oh yeah. So I went in, and it was a Muslim man, okay, that owned the shop in the old city, and I was looking around, and of course he's telling me the glories of this shirt, and it's the best shirt that there ever, the whole thing, buttering up, it's that you couldn't make a better choice than this shirt, young man. It's a bargain. And of course he asked this exorbitant amount of money for it, okay, which is exactly what we're going to see here also. And I remember talking to him, and I was able to, fortunately, kind of play the game with him. We chatted back and forth. I asked about his family. He asked about my family, yada, yada, the whole thing. Okay, this is not a quick sale, okay? I'm probably in here easily 15, 20 minutes to purchase this shirt, easily, okay? And finally, I said to him, well, look, I know you're a generous guy, and I know this is a fantastic shirt, but, I think he wanted, that's been a while ago, quite a while ago. I think he wanted $25 for it, the shirt. Okay.
American dollars.
Yeah, American dollars for this. I mean, it was like a very simple shirt. So,
bargain.
Yeah, and I go, this is like in early 1980s. Okay. So I said, it's a great shirt, love the colors and all that. 25, just, I just don't know how my family's going to eat if I do that. You know what I mean? The whole, you got to play it. This is the way they play it. This is what's happening here. We're reading. Okay. Right. So I said, well, but tell you what, I would gladly give you $6 for the shirt. Okay. So then he comes back.
How many do you want?
Yeah. Then he comes back and he says, well, my children only have enough bread for a few, the whole thing, but I'll gladly sell it to you for $17. And so it goes back and forth until finally, I think it was, we settled on $8, I think, if I remember correctly. So we settled on 8, and I said, 8's fine with me. I can accept that. I said, can you accept 8? He says, 8's good. And so I said, it's a deal. He says, it's a deal. We shook. I hand him $8. He puts the shirt in a bag. He walks over, and this guy I'm pretty big. Okay, I'm, 6'4", okay? And this guy was probably 6'7", okay? He was a big guy. He comes up to me, okay? And I'm going, okay, am I going to get punched now?
How much more money do you want?
Yeah, exactly. He kind of almost towers over me. He reaches out his hand, he grabs my neck, okay, firmly.
He does kick you.
No, and he says, "You're a good man." In other words, it was a acceptable sale. I didn't pull the typical American thing on him. Ugly Americans.
What would that be?
Yeah, well,
What was that?
it ain't worth this. You tell them it's no. I didn't play that
You
game.
still have the shirt?
Yeah, I don't think I do. I don't think.
$12 for it.
Yeah, right. So at any rate, I know how this is played. I've done it myself, and this is the format that's going on here. So in verses 7, 8, 9, there has been this polite discussion among all the leaders there. Ephraim sitting among them. Okay, and then of course it says that Abraham stands up. That means the idiom, he's going to make a proposal. He's going to make an offer. Okay, that's what it means by he stands up. So he first bows in respect to all of these people. Okay, and he enlists the city officials as these go-betweens to ask for a specific negotiation for the specific property owned by Ephraim. Okay? You see it there? Okay. So it says in verse 7, he rose, he bowed to the people, sons of Heth. He spoke with them. So he doesn't speak first to Ephraim, right? He speaks to them, all the people, the guys there at the city gate. Okay? And then he says, okay, if it's your wish for me to bury my dead out of my sight, in other words, I've got to do this. Okay, time is moving on here in the decomposition process. He says, hear me, and please approach Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me. So they then, these intermediaries, grant this. And they say, okay, talk to him. You two talk about terms. Then in verse 9, he says that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, which is at the end of his field, for the full price. Let him give it to me in your presence for burial site. So he makes his specific proposal here. All right? That is, he needs a formal negotiation with clear terms. He wants a clear legal deed, as he not only intends to bury Sarah here, but you realize he's actually purchasing a family plot. And you notice this because we find that in Genesis 49, verses 29 and 30, we don't have to turn there, but in those verses, we realize that we're told that Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah also end up in the future, they're going to be buried there too, with Abraham himself. So Sarah dies, she's buried, Abraham dies, he's going to be buried there, and all these others in the family lineage are also going to be buried there. Machpelah, the name of the cave, literally in Hebrew means double. Okay? Therefore, some people believe that it may mean caves, not just cave. Some people think that it's double because there was a smaller cave that led to a bigger cave behind it. Some people, and there is archaeological evidence of this, that it may have had to do with a cave on top of another cave. Okay? Double, we don't know exactly. But the point is, it was going to be a bigger area so that future burials could occur there. Okay? He notices that he's defining this. It's at the end of this property, owned by Ephron, okay? And he's going to note there that it's the ground, the cave is at the end of it, or the caves possibly at the end of it. He notes about the trees. You notice that? Because right in this area are the oaks of Mamre that have been talked about prior in previous discussion, and we taught Genesis earlier. And of course, he wants title deed of the whole thing. Now, it's interesting. He says, for the full price, let him give it to me in your presence for the burial site. Now, why does he say in your presence? Do you know why?
Witnesses.
Witnesses. That is, if he would have just dealt with Ephron, and it only been a discussion between the two of them, and they negotiated a settlement, and a price was paid, Ephron could have come back and said, well, you didn't buy that. You just gave me a 10% down. But when it's clearly stated in front of all of these places in the legal spot, okay, then it's a formal presentation to purchase this, and therefore, if an agreement is made, it's a sealed deal. It's a titled land that occurs. So he's willing to pay the full price, but of course, it's got to be verified by the witnesses so that it's completely legal. Now, verses 10 through 16. Let's read them. Now, Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth, even of all who went in at the gate of the city, saying, no, my Lord, hear me. I will give you the field, and I will give you the cave that's in it. In the presence of the sons of my people, I give it to you, bury your dead. And Abraham bowed before the people of the land. In other words, he shows respect when he hears this offer, okay? I think you're going to find from what goes on later, this is a ruse. This is a false politeness. He doesn't mean to give it to him at all. You're going to see here in a minute. And then in verse 13, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, if you will only please listen to me, I will give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. In other words, he's countering and saying, I don't want your goodwill that says I can bury my wife in one of these caves. I want your legal title to your land and the cave and the trees and the field. You see what I'm saying? Because if he just says, okay, I'll bury her there without making it legal and paying the money, they could turn around the next day literally and say, well, that's not yours, and he would have no access to the place he buried his wife. Or he would not have a future a burial plot also for future generations. Does that make sense? So this is why this stuff is being said. And then it says, he says, then Ephron, verse 14, answered Abraham and said to him, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver by commercial standard. All right. Now, let's talk about this. As we said, the negotiation begins, it's public, and even though he allegedly will give it, the property, that's not what he means, okay? And of course, he needs the legal binding basis for it. It's interesting that these verses, I believe, are an embedded prophetic message, and a message that's true of the time, at least since 1948, and probably even more true now in the current era in terms of Israel. And let me tell you why I think there's a prophetic embedded message here. Ephron, his name means in Hebrew, a man of the dust, an earthly man, okay? A man of the world system. All right, so you get the idea. the spiritual contrast that's going to go on here between he and Abraham. It says he's the son of Heth. The Hebrew, I'm probably going to mispronounce it to you. Maybe, Bill, you can help me. What it says in Hebrew is the son of Chet. Or, you know, if it's,
Oh,
okay? Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. But that's what it says in the Hebrew, it's the son of Chet, C-H-E-T. Chet in Hebrew means, or the son of Chet means a son of terror. A son of terror. And so this man offers to Abraham, and what does Abraham's name mean? The father of many nations, okay? The father of a new nation, the father of a unique nation, that is going to be called Israel. So the sons of terror, that is Ephron and his fellows, okay, are surrounding, they're all around him at the gate, surrounding this man of faith, this spiritual man. And where is it that this is occurring? Hebron. Currently,
no.
today, we call this the West Bank. Okay? The West Bank. It is currently appreciably under Palestinian Authority. Originally, not long ago, and I don't know if this is still true or it's changed in the last few years, but originally in this area, there were 400 Jewish settlers that lived right around Hebron that were actually protected by 3,000 IDF soldiers. Because remember, there's a mosque there, okay? There's allegedly this, the burial spot there, the caves, okay? So it literally, of the foremost famous historical, well-known and revered sites in Israel, this is one of them, Hebron. So this is an extremely important place. Right. So what we're seeing here, I don't want to get too political, but is what I would call the tragedy of the two-state solution. Okay? That is, the two-state solution set up a situation where the land, as it's was spiritually supposed to be, that is controlled by Israel, now gets temporarily controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And who is the military wing of the Palestinian Authority in this area? Well, that's one of them.
Hamas. They're all.
Okay. But one of the major military wings is Hamas. Okay. And what does Hamas mean?
Terror, trouble.
It means violence and terror. So, interestingly, what was true then in Abraham's experience is also true now. A parallel, even though thousands of years later. Now, it's interesting that the only solution to this perpetual problem that seems to have no solution no matter who approaches it, okay, the only solution to this is going to be by Messiah King, who will come back and settle this issue permanently. That is, when he establishes his millennial kingdom. Now, verses 12 and 13, he enters into this negotiation. He bows to these people. He agrees to Ephron's terms, but indicates that he urgently needs this issue to be solved because he needs to quickly bury his wife. In verses 14 and 15, Ephron begins with what we can only call the top end offer. Okay? That is, he offers he asks an outrageous sum of money and claims that this land, okay, is worth 400 shekels in silver weight. This would be an absolutely exorbitant price. Let me give you a couple examples, okay, of why I'm saying this is exorbitant. By comparison, turn to Jeremiah 32. Jeremiah 32. We're going to read verses 8 and 9. So Jeremiah has this relative, okay? Actually it's his uncle's son. His name is Hanamel, okay? And he says, then Hanamel, my uncle's son, came to me in the court of the guard, according to the word of the Lord, and said to me, buy my field, please, that is at the Anathoth, which is in the land of Benjamin, for you have the right of possession, and the redemption is yours. Buy it for yourself. Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord. Now this is, remember we talked about if people fall into debt, they can sell their land and pay the debt off that way. So there then becomes a temporary new owner. Well, this relative as him became the owner of this property that was Jeremiah's ancestral territory. Then notice verse 9. And I bought the field, which is at the Anathoth, from Hanamel, my uncle's son, and I weighed out the silver for him, 17 shekels of silver. Now think about that. He just bought back a whole family territory area for 17 shekels of silver. And what does our dear friend want for this? Ephron want for this? 400 shekels of silver. Well, let me give you another example. Okay. Turn to 2 Samuel 24. Back to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 24. And we're going to read verse 24. This is about King David. Remember, David conquers the Jebusite city that we call Jerusalem. But it was, for a long, long time, it was controlled by the Jebusites.
Right.
You know, they have this campaign against it through some of the tunnels. They become successful. They overcome the walls that are these tremendous Jebusite walls. And of course, then they take it over. But verse 24, however, the king said to Araunah, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor of Araunah, okay, and the oxen there of the threshing floor for 50 shekels of silver. Now, if you wanted to buy an extremely pricey area in Israel, that would be it. Why?
Flat land.
No, even more than that. What's going to occur in not very long on this very site?
Temple.
Simple, yeah, Solomon's going to build the temple on this site.
Oh,
Oh, so you're saying if your landlord would say, I got you now.
In other words,
He needs to.
if you want to compare valuable property, what David buys for 50 shekels of silver is really valuable property. Compare that to this, backwoods rural plot outside of Hebron. He's asking 400 shekels of silver for.
it's got caves.
It's got caves, yeah. Okay, they better have gold in the
Oh, I
caves.
think that's where, isn't that where all the bell caves are?
I'm not certain. Not certain
Or
about that.
around in that area? Huh?
They're over
The bell caves are where?
west of there.
West of there, okay. Now notice Ephron minimizes the exorbitant cost that he's asking by saying, in essence, well, that's a trifling amount between rich guys like you and me. You see it? Chump change. It's chump change.
Yeah.
Why even concern yourself with the number?
Just give me the money.
Just give me the money, okay? That's what he's saying to him. Now,
In front of everybody.
yeah, in front of everybody. Now notice, Abraham agrees to this exorbitant price, and unlike typical negotiations in the Middle East, he makes no counteroffer.
Right.
None,
Just listen.
okay? No counteroffer. So he ends up weighing out 400 shekels weight of silver. Typically, there were no coins then. So if you had silver, it was usually in silver dust or silver granules or silver pieces that had been mined out and refined out of the ground and refined. And you kept them in a pouch or a bag, and you had a little scale, okay? And the scale would therefore tell you what a shekel's worth was. So they measure this all out so that now he has 400 shekels worth of silver. That's what's going on, okay? Now, question. And I think this is an interesting spiritual lesson, okay? Why did Abraham agree to be ripped off? He had to have known he was ripped off. He didn't even argue against being ripped off. Why?
Was it Jewish?
Turn to the Gospel of Matthew.
Wanted it.
Turn to the Gospel of Matthew. I think there's an important principle here, and I think it's something that we all need to learn. Okay? Matthew 5, starting in verse 39. Jesus says to his followers, "But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him also have your coat too. And whoever shall force you to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." Now, people have, I believe, badly misinterpreted these verses. That is, they've taken what is the principle of pacifism. Okay? That is, pacifists believe you never resist an evil man, you never resist a strong-armed man, you never have any physical resistance to being hit or knocked down, or you just absorb it. Okay? But really, if you look at Jesus' life, he really was not a pacifist. Either that, or how do you explain what happened at the temple when he sees them bargaining, okay, and making the temple a merchandise house, and the pacifist who says this in Matthew 5 blows up in anger, turning over the tables and yelling at them, saying, "Quit making my father's house a house of merchandise," right? So the point I'm making is that I think we need to learn that that unfair treatment or seemingly unfair treatment from others can lead to a spiritual or a future good that outweighs the injustice of the moment. Let me say it again. Okay? I think we need to learn the spiritual principle that unfair treatment from others can lead to a spiritual or a future good that ends up outweighing the injustice of the moment and the unfair treatment that we receive from others. In other words, it's an investment in something better. Okay, we have to accept that sometimes we're not going to get fair, because that's not the real deal that we should be looking at. Not saying that's true of all things. I'm not saying you should go out and buy a car that way, and pay DOT sticker price. But there's a spiritual principle here. Now, why do I say that? Well, because Jesus, who was falsely accused of many, many crimes that he never committed, who was persecuted, who was talked down, who was ridiculed, who was spat upon, who was tried unfairly and unjustly, who was convicted of crimes that he never committed, and he was nailed on a cross. Can we get more unfair than that? Okay. What's the good? The good is that's the price, the unfair price that was paid for our redemption. True? I think we need to look at that in our own lives. There are times in which we need to be more wise spiritually than the corrupt person of the world that's dealing with us. there may be a good in not resisting in this particular situation. Just consider it as a possibility, okay? So finally, verses 17 through 20, back in our text to finish tonight. Turn back to 23 here. Says, so Ephron's field, which was in Machpelah, which faced Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees which were in the field that were within the confines of its border were deeded over to Abraham for possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in at the gate of the city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field at Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is the area of Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave and all that is in it were deeded over to Abraham for a burial site by the sons of Heth. So the legal terms were clear. Field, trees, oak of Mamre, cave or caves, all deeded over, verified by all these witnesses. And now, interestingly, for the first time, Abraham, the sojourner, the alien, becomes a mini landowner. Isn't it interesting? He becomes a mini landowner of a very small area comparatively, okay? But he's going to end up, because of this, in the future, and his relatives, with a far bigger territory, that is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. And we can almost see what he does here as a small down payment of what's to come. Does that make sense? I think that's the way we should look at it spiritually. Now, Mamre, which speaks of this, what originally was apparently a very huge oak there, means strength. And of course, it's these oak trees. Also, we see here that Ephron's material gain, which was notoriously unfair, was actually his weakness. And it was actually, in this unfair transaction, it becomes Abraham's future strength. That is, you've got to lose to gain. You've got to give up to have. It's this spiritual principle that we see all the way through. And even though we read it, isn't it hard for us to live it? Don't we struggle to live it? We hate to be treated unfairly, right? Usually we complain our heads off when we're treated unfairly. But yet, there can be a spiritual reason to accept it in certain circumstances, right? So, the purchase was deeded over. The word deeded over, interestingly, in Hebrew means to raise up or to elevate, okay? Now, why? Why that word is chosen? Because I think what we're seeing here is that this pagan land was secured for godly purposes. It became elevated, not only for a burial site, but obviously for more patriarchs that live in this territory, for their wives, and these people end up being buried, and this becomes really the small plot of land, a territorial inroad, or like I said, a down payment of what is going to come in the future. In the future, there's going to be the conquest of the land, okay, by Joshua. There's going to be, after that, the Davidic kingdom. And under that, as we studied in 2 Samuel, there's a huge amount of territory, not only all of Israel proper, but even way north of it and east of it, that of course is controlled in David's monarchy. And then finally, the ultimate, that is Messiah's 1,000-year reign on earth, in which he will settle the issue of the land forever. So that's the chapter. And I hope you gained something of value in it. I think it had some interesting embedded information in it. So, yeah, Bill.
You were talking about embedded information. You talked earlier about, you called it, I think, the Hebrew letter.
Yes.
Is the value of 8, which is resurrection or new beginning. The 400.
Yeah, I didn't think about the number 400 in it. 4 times 100.
Yeah, well, yeah, 400, the numerical or the letter for that is Tav,
Tav.
which is a sign of the cross.
That's right, because Tav looks like
It's in
this.
silver, which is usually redemption.
Right.
And then you have
The cross.
the tree, the cross, you have the cave where he's buried, and then the land.
Yeah.
So there's a lot
Yeah.
of reasons for those values.
Exactly.
For future.
It's embedded information for connections to even Jesus' day and the things that go on there. So again,
Can't go there today.
yeah, I know.
Certain times I think you can.
Oh, no.
They're
Under
crossing.
guard,
Yeah,
maybe
it's hard.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
you can.
So at any rate, the living word. So let me pray for us to end this, and we'll stop tonight. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for your word as always. We're always amazed at what's in it. We read the surface of it, and we briefly read these sentences, and yet we then overlook all this information that you've embedded in it, this spiritual information, this spiritual insight, these teachings that you have for us, even prophetic elements as we talked about tonight. So we thank you again for this night. Thank you for your word. And of course, we lift all these things up in Jesus' name. Amen.